Welcome to another episode of Intuitive Reactions, the MENA and Gulf regions, that I call Syria and the Arab Bazaar. Lord Palmerston, who became UK Prime Minister at the young age of 70, and who believed in robust, he described them as manly, foreign policies, reputedly said in 1848, "Nations have no eternal allies. Nations have no perpetual enemies. Only their interests are eternal and perpetual." This quotation flitted across my mind again a few days ago when I learned that the Arab League had readmitted Syria into the fold. So let me first remind you briefly here why there is such a kerfuffle about the readmission of a failed state into the Arab League and its reintegration into the Arab fold. In a nutshell, I can attribute it to the brutal and merciless rule of the Assad regime from father to son, which, mind you, I suppose could also speak somehow to the less than benevolent rule of many other Arab leaders. Otherwise, why would they readmit Syria's Assad given his unspeakable atrocities against the people of Syria? Chemical weapons, barrel bombs, mass torture and executions, or deliberate starvation. A fellow at a think tank recently posted a rather graphic reminder that Assad had killed 500,000 of his own people, that 130,000 Syrians had disappeared under his rule, that he dropped 82,000 barrel bombs, conducted 340 chemical attacks, and ran a narco state worth billions of dollars. The numbers he used are not those quoted by every organization, but let's not quibble about that, and let's focus on the bigger picture. You commit all these crimes, and you're given your seat back at the Arab League. Wow. Wow indeed. But wow is an emotive and angry exclamation. Much as I don't necessarily dismiss it, I'd rather look at this matter rationally. So here is my take on it. There are some Arab countries that have eagerly wanted to normalize relations with President Assad because it suits their political and economic interests. Then, there are countries like Jordan and perhaps also Iraq or Egypt stating that this Arab initiative for readmission remains conditional and also incremental, depending on how Syria acts on the Captagon amphetamines it produces and then sends out to Saudi Arabia and other countries via Lebanon or Jordan. Only a few days ago, remember, Jordanian fighters killed a man known as the Syrian Escobar in a factory somewhere between the Syrian southern towns of Dar'a and Suwaida. But this readmission also depends, or so we're told, on the resettlement of the millions of Syrian refugees draining the depleted economies of some Arab countries. Lebanon is an example. Furthermore, the Arab initiative is not purportedly meant to apply a pan-Arab approach. Rather, each country can choose its own level of relations. Hence, the UAE might be very keen, whereas Saudi Arabia and Jordan might calibrate their level of relations gradually according to how Assad delivers on these issues. And there are also those like Qatar and Morocco who are more recalcitrant and would not wish to normalize relations now. But whilst this rationale is clearly interest-based and could have also suited Lord Palmerston down to a T, it does not address the issues from any moral, ethical, or even pragmatic standpoint. After all, the regime has regained control of much of the country, even though the northeast and northwest regions aren't fully under its control. But my fundamental problem lies with the fact that I don't believe the regime will enforce any of its commitments. With Russia and Iran still major stakeholders, it can have its cake and eat it. Yep, it obtained a get-out-of-jail card, but in return for what? A regime that perpetrated so many crimes is suddenly meant to turn into a pliant neighbor? Tell me, does a leopard ever change its spots, especially when there are no other leopards who are allowed in? Now, I fully take on board the argument that it's better to have Syria inside the Arab fold than outside it. But better for whom? And much as I agree that most Arab countries either have autocrats or despots as rulers, with perhaps a couple of exceptions, and therefore Syria is not the only felonious member of the Arab League, the fact remains that his record qualifies him for a mention in the Guinness Book of Records when it comes to crimes and violence. But then you might also tell me, so what? The Arab League is a defunct and symbolic organization that is pretty much toothless, clawless, clueless, ergo useless. So let him get his seat back and get on with it. But the fact remains that many Arab regimes have become increasingly more authoritative over the past decade and are willing to crush any attempt at human rights or freedom or self-expression. They're still smarting from the shock of the Arab uprisings, and they'll do anything to ensure that their hold on power isn't threatened once more by their peoples. And given that international geopolitics of the region has been changing dramatically, think China if nothing else, accountability is way down in the ruler's priorities, and entitlement is way up again with some of those who take their hold on power as a matter of right, not choice. You seek a recent example? I give you Sudan. For this so-called conditional and incremental agreement, I suppose it ultimately boils down, for me, on how much I trust the ruler in Damascus. But since the political genes of many regional rulers aren't conducive to inclusiveness, to put it mildly, I fear for the future of the Syrian people. In a tweet this week, the Lebanese Progressive Socialist Party leader Walid Jumblat likened the Arab League to a titanic ship that is carrying the Syrian people to certain drowning. Have they asked the Syrian people whether they want to return to the Arab fold? Of course not, he added wryly. But another question rears its head here. What will the West, what will we do now? Much of the West is dictated by Lord Palmerston's Moors. This is politics. But the key difference is that they do not kill and maim in the process. Rather, they achieve results subtly, covertly, or by using their soft rather than hard power. Forget the Europe before Brexit and before the pandemic. Forget Europe before the Ukraine war. Now, we in Europe are also immersed in culture wars, as has been the case elsewhere. You seek an example of how the West is struggling with all these issues? Just look at the USA. In my perhaps controversial opinion, human beings and the rule of law aren't genetically compatible. This is almost a jurisprudential statement. But the difference is not necessarily the word democracy, however defined, that contrasts the West from other parts of the world. Rather, it is the unavoidable reality that the West still enjoys institutions preventing its unfettered abuse of power. The West is still answerable to its population, just, and therefore there are still checks and balances that can control much of its errant behavior. And heaven help us if or when they disappear, and when the rights of ordinary people are stealthily nibbled away more and more. So will the West make peace with Syria? Will the West perhaps be dragged into the money-making debate on reconstruction, as this agenda is also implicit in the readmission? Perhaps not yet, not now. But now is a very brittle concept in politics. So buckle up for a bumpy ride. The world is changing fast, and not necessarily, at least for me, for the better. And welcome to a bazaar where the rules aren't always meant to be clear.